Thanks a lot. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Elvira, for the nice introduction. Also, that I would like to, of course, emphasize also that I've taken up the job as director of Circle at University not that long ago. Well, it's already quite some time ago. I started there in January, time has gone very fast, almost for a year there now. And what I would like to do in my presentation here is to give you some kind of outline of what we have labeled Evolutionary Economic Geography. What we try to do is to apply some principles from evolutionary economics into the field of economic geography. And what I have in mind is to give a bit of outline of empirical studies that have been conducted. Of course, when you're invited to give a research seminar, you have two choices, right? So you concentrate on just one empirical paper and you just go into detail and present that paper, and that's what I normally do, to be honest. But here I thought, well, okay, it's really nice to be here at this institute and maybe also to reflect a bit on what I've been doing myself for, let's say, the last 5 or maybe even 10 years, and just give a kind of concise summary of what evolutionary economic geography stands for, and especially what in what fields or what kind of topics it has been empirically applied. So to give you some idea, and I have 1 hour to do that, and that's also quite a challenge, to be honest. But that's what I would like to prefer to do. So also what I, of course, will try to avoid as much as possible to go into all kinds of theoretical elaborations and all kinds of conceptual building blocks. So of course I could also talk for hours on that. But I really would like to go as much as possible to empirical applications, empirical studies, just to see, okay, what have we achieved so far, or what haven't we yet achieved? And I will also present it in such a way that that I think that evolutionary economic geography and the research program is really something that is still under construction. Okay, some achievements have been made, but there are still also a lot of gaps to be filled, and some research questions that are still open. And I really would like to share that with you today. So, well, I forgot to include an overview of my lecture, but I will talk for about 5 minutes on evolutionary economics in general. Of course, I don't have to introduce that to an audience like here, but I just want to emphasize a bit from where we depart. And if we do evolutionary economic geography, then what we tend to do is look at the micro level. So we go back to firms and we reason from that, and then we go to all kinds of topics that are normally addressed in the field of economic geography. So where do firms locate? Why do industries concentrate in space? Why are networks spatially concentrated? Why are there hubs in knowledge networks? Why do regions grow more than other regions? These are typical kind of conventional questions in economic geography, but I think adding to that an evolutionary perspective might provide some additional insights to what we already know in that particular field of research. So just let me introduce a bit about evolutionary economics, the way at least, and this is all, you're all familiar with it. Of course, this is, to me, this is a kind of Bible, of course, the book by Nelson Winter, published in 1982. Just one slide, just to outline where we depart from. Again, you're familiar with that, but just to introduce that, and I will come back to those notions when I go to empirical studies in economic geography. So, of course, the evolutionary economics, at least part of that, is very much focused on population dynamics of firms. It's about how firms develop routines over time and how firms compete with each other based on those routines. And as we all know, it is very difficult for other firms to replicate successful routines. for all kinds of reasons. I don't really have to go into that, but there's bounding rationality, there's attached knowledge dimension to it. And that, of course, summing that up, it means that you have heterogeneity of firms. Firms build firm-specific competences all the time, and it's very difficult for other firms to copy or imitate those. So there is variation. Well, there is also mutation, because some firms, of course, will innovate and come up with new products, etc. Try to outcompete others also in that. And then, of course, the selection environment makes that some firms will do well and other firms will not do well. Then you really go into the firm dynamics and you try to explain, okay, why some firms prosper and other firms stagnate and decline and have to exit the market. Of course, the selection environment is really quite well broadly defined. It's based on pure market competition, but also the institutional context makes that some firms are more adaptable to a particular context than other firms, and that's why some firms will grow, others will decline. Also, what's important, of course, in that field of research is the notion of retention, in the sense that the knowledge or the competences accumulate mainly within boundaries of firms. They accumulate over time, so there's a kind of cumulative nature of that. So the knowledge that is created will not get lost as soon as it has been accepted more or less by the selection environment. And firms keep on building on that. Search process is localized. Firms try to stick as much as possible to the markets and the technologies they have become familiar with in the past. So there is a cumulative nature, and in particular within the boundaries of the firm, but also knowledge will spill over to other firms now and then. Although I said before that the replication process is really noisy and difficult and not unproblematic, but some knowledge will spill over from one firm to the other. That might go through generations of firms, like this has been modeled as a spin-off process, in which firms grow out of existing firms, in which the routines within the parent organization are inherited and transferred to new generations of firms. So again, there's a cumulative nature, there's a kind of retention in this social process of learning. And that's how it is explained why some firms again do well and other firms will not do well. Well, this is, let's say, in 3 minutes, what, let's say, micro foundation of evolution economics is about, at least as I've interpreted it. And this is what we basically use in our work on economic geography, and we apply this to all kinds of topics. When we started to develop this field of evolution economic geography, it was about, well, we started about 10, maybe even 15 years ago. And by that time, evolution economics was basically very aspatial, right? So there was, I could not find much, not much serious geography in the work on evolution economics. And that was one of the main reasons why we decided, okay, let's see if we, let's say, add an evolutionary approach to all kinds of conventional topics in economic geography, can we bring in new additional insights. And to some extent we believe, or we have provided some of those, and I will present those in my presentation. Because if you, let's say, theorize and conceptualize common topics in economic geography, and you add an evolutionary flavor to that, I think you can bring additional insights to that field of research. Well, we have done many publications on that. One of the main statements on that was the Handbook of Evolution Economic Geography that was published in 2010, which I edited together with Ron Martin from Cambridge University. What I would like to do is to concentrate on a number of empirical applications. One is, where do industries locate? As we know, most not all industries, but most industries, especially the most knowledge-intensive, do concentrate in space. And when you, and this again, it's a very conventional topic that has been already addressed for more than 100 years in economic geography, going even back to Marshall and others. And what, if you take an evolutionary perspective, you depict the spatial clustering of an industry as an evolutionary process through spin-off dynamics, and I will explain that in my presentation. Then the second type of application is really about network and network analysis, and we tend to look at knowledge networks and how they evolve over time in space. And I think two major applications have been done till so far. One is about the selective nature of networks, which tries to explain why some cluster firms are highly connected in knowledge networks while others are not or poorly connected. And this would not be predicted by the cluster theory, which is really basically about, okay, cluster firms will benefit from each other co-presence, while the network approach says, okay, it's not a matter of being located in a cluster per se, but what matters is whether you're connected in a local knowledge network, and not every cluster firm is connected to that. Then the second application within that field of knowledge network is really about the dynamics of spatial networks. So how do knowledge networks evolve over time? Who connects with whom? And how is that determined by all kinds of factors? There are quite a number of very recent examples that have jumped on that particular topic. And then there is a third main field which tries to explain why countries grow more than other countries, why regions grow more than other regions. So a very conventional topic again. And there I think we have added additional insights by the notion of related variety, the notion of regional branching, which also provides an analytical framework for how regions or countries diversify over time. They tend to do so in related activities, and I will come back to that a bit later. Please interrupt me if you have questions. I think we have an hour, so I think there's plenty of time. Okay, let's first to the first topic, to the first field of applications. I would like to draw a bit of attention to, and that is to depict clustering as an evolutionary process. As I said before, there's a lot of literature and a lot of empirical studies in the field of economic geography that try to explain why an industry will concentrate in space. And many of those studies tend to refer to Marshall's work in the early 2000s when he described that firms will cluster in the same industry because they can benefit from each other co-presence, right? As Marshall, for example, put it, knowledge is in the air in a cluster, and if you're not part of that cluster, you will not have access to that knowledge that circulates around, and therefore cluster firms will outcompete non-cluster firms. And this has been a quite dominant view in this literature, and has provided an explanatory framework for why industries will concentrate in space. Well, if you take an evolutionary perspective, you provide a kind of alternative explanation. So it might not be the fact that clusters exist and persist over time because cluster firms will outperform non-cluster firms, but cluster and the evolution of a cluster is depicted as a snowball process through spin-off dynamics, which means that in those type of models, new firms spin off from existing firms in a region and inherit routines from the parent. And then I'm explicitly referring to the work of the late Stephen Klepper, that really has done a lot of work and provided the main inputs to this line of thinking. For example, a very well-known paper that he published in 2007 was about why the American car industry concentrated in the Detroit area. And then the big question was the Detroit area providing all kinds of benefits to car manufacturers in that region, or was it because of this spin-off process that just by accident Detroit got early entrance in the emergent phase of the industry, and that led to a whole spin-off process, and because spin-offs tend to locate near their parent organization, it made the industry concentrate in that particular area and in other parts of the US. So this, I think it's a really nice and of course alternative explanation to the Marshallian hypothesis, and of course then it's up to empirical research who is right. Is it true that clusters exist and persist because of localization economies, as it is called, or Marshallian externalities, or is it because of this spin-off process? Of course, if you believe in the spin-off process, it makes also that clusters, once established, are self-reproducing, even if localizations economies are absent or they might even be negative. This is not really mirror, right? So if through spin-off dynamics, an industry will concentrate in a particular region, it might be the case that there might be even localization diseconomies, so that it is really hard to survive for firms in that particular area. But because of this spin-off process that will keep going on, the industry will remain concentrated in that particular area. So I think that's a really nice and new type of insight. And then, of course, it is up to empirical research who is right. Well, there have been quite a number of longitudinal studies on a number of industries, and those studies tend to follow the whole life cycle of an industry at the firm level. So what they collect is, they try to collect as much as information on all firms that ever existed in that industry over time. So they really go to the emergence phase, when the first firm was established in that particular industry, and then of course what they're interested in, where new firms locate, what is the performance of those firms in terms of survival, what is the pre-entry background of the entrepreneur, in the sense that are spin-off companies performing better than other type of entrants. That type of information is collected, and then you do those type of studies and try to see whether spin-off dynamics are the main driving force for the spatial concentration of an industry, or is it Marshallian externalities that matter in that respect? Or it might be even the case that those are complementary explanations, because it might be the case that in the first stage of the life cycle, the spin-off dynamics are most crucial, but as soon as there a kind of critical threshold is reached within a particular region, then localization economies might come into being, and that further supports the growth of that industry in that particular area. So there might also be complementary, but of course, again, it's up to empirical research who is right. Well, as I said, a lot of studies already being collected, have been carried out about the global fashion industry, the US and the British car industry, the US tire industry, the US semiconductors, Dutch publishing industry, German laser industry. And what those studies tend to show, it is that it is through spin-off dynamics that industries tend to concentrate in space, and that Marshallian externalities do not really play a role in that respect. So I think that's a very important outcome. Well, you might still ask the question then, might it be the case that some regions are more favorable from the beginning than other types of regions? Because if it goes through the spin-off process, it means that it can happen everywhere, right? It is just the place that was, let's say, lucky to have early entrants that generated a lot of spin-offs in the same area that became the winner. It might be the case that some regions are more favorable to generate a spin-off than other places. And in fact, it's what seems to matter here is that if there are already related industries in a particular area, and with related industries I mean competences and capabilities that are present in an industry that can still be useful and relevant for the new industry, then of course those new firms that enter that new industry might draw on those local resources. So some regions might be more favorable to develop a new industry from the very beginning. And that, in fact, is what we found. For example, we did a study on the British car industry, for example. Why did it concentrate in the Coventry Birmingham area? Because Coventry was already a center of bicycle making in the 1880s, just before the car industry took off in that area. And many entrepreneurs, and especially the most successful entrepreneurs in that area, indeed had a background in cycle making industries. Of course, if you already had acquired some experience in that particular industry, you did not start from scratch when setting up a new company in the new car industry, and therefore you already had some advantage. And of course, if you have a place where those related industries are already present, it means that you might have a higher probability to generate that spin-off process in that particular area, and therefore the industry will concentrate in that region. Well, of course, there's a lot to be said on this. As I said, quite many of industry studies have been carried out. As I said, also, most of those studies tend to show that spin-off dynamics is really a crucial driving force behind the spatial concentration of an industry. But of course, it might differ from industry to industry. And indeed, we find some evidence. For example, we did just a study on the global video game industry. So we have collected information on every video game firm that ever existed from 1972 till now. And we knew exactly in which places they concentrated worldwide. And then we again tested whether spin-off dynamics or localization economies mattered in that particular industry. And there we found that localization economies mattered. And it might be because of the peculiarity of that particular industry, which is a project-based creative industry, in which if you co-develop new video games, you have to come together and share knowledge. So local buzz might then be a quite important mechanism through which knowledge is shared. Also, you have to know who is whom and who is a good reputation, and it is easier to find out about these things when you're all co-located in the same area. So here we found for this industry that localization economies matter. And although the spin-off process also contributed to the spatial clustering of the industry. So it might matter, it might differ from industry to industry, and we would say, well, we need more studies to come to more general conclusions. Well, there are a lot of issues that are on the table with this type of research. Well, just go through a few of them. Of course, what is the effect of major disruptions during the industry life cycle? For example, as we all know, in this British car industry, the British car industry was almost wiped out. Japanese competition as soon as the Japanese could enter the British market. That is kind of disruption to the industry. And then, of course, is it then still a matter of dynamic capabilities, which determines which firm will survive that change in the selection environment? What is the role of institutions? There's a lot of literature saying that there is it's a co-evolutionary process in which institutions emerge alongside the emergence of an industry in a particular area. So it co-evolves as soon as it grows together with the industry in a particular regional setting. What about the role of merger and acquisition activity? We just completed a study on the Dutch banking industry. We had data from 1850 till now on every Dutch bank that ever existed during that period. And there we found that merger and acquisition activity was really a driver of spatial clustering, because Amsterdam banks especially were extremely active in taking over other banks, not only in the Amsterdam area but also in other parts of the Netherlands, and that's why this industry became much more concentrated. Also because those Amsterdam banks really acquired a lot of competences in taking over other banks, and they became very successful in doing so, and that's why some banks took over many other banks because they became very good at it. And then, of course, the issue is about networks, because this literature on the industry life cycle has not yet devoted too much attention to network dimension. So they still seem to assume that firms just compete with each other but do not collaborate. Well, of course, in practice we know, especially for those project-based creative industries, that a lot of collaboration is going on, and it's quite essential to survive in those particular industries. And therefore, a network approach would be also appropriate to add to this type of studies. So then the question, of course, is what is the effect of the position of each entrant in a knowledge network during the life cycle of an industry? Will your survival rate increase when you are not really highly connected in the emergence phase, but in the later phase of the life cycle of an industry? I mean, you can think about a lot of hypotheses, which I don't think I've seen too many studies on that so far. So that's one application. Just to give you some idea about, I think, or what you could conclude still so far on the work we have been doing till so far, is that okay, it's quite a promising alternative framework to include spin-off dynamics in the explanation of the spatial concentration of an industry. Then, of course, there's let's say more an emerging literature on networks and how firms not only compete but also interact and collaborate. I think there has been quite successful application in cluster research in that. In the sense, as I already said in the introduction, well, if you have to take Marshall literally, what he said is that knowledge is in the air, is in clusters. So it's just a matter of being part of a cluster, because then you will get access to the knowledge that is in the air, as Marshall put it. Well, if you do analysis of knowledge networks, and you actually look at who's sharing and exchanging knowledge with whom, then we find out, of course, that knowledge networks are selective, as Giuliani and others have formulated it, which means that some knowledge firms are highly connected to the local knowledge networks, while others are not. So this literature is saying, well, it's not just a matter of being part of a cluster, but being part of a local knowledge network. And then, of course, the intriguing question appears, okay, what makes that some cluster firms are highly connected, while others are not? Well, then I think you have to go back to the firm, because firms differ from each other. And firms develop different routines over time. And this literature tends to show that, for example, the higher the absorptive capacity of a firm, the more likely this firm will connect to others, because the higher the absorptive capacity, the more likely everybody wants to connect to you, because you might have knowledge that might be quite essential. And therefore, these knowledge networks tend to be selective, and only a few firms are highly connected in those networks. Well then, yeah, sorry.
Could I ask you a question? I'm a bit slow in processing, so I'm still about the first thing, the clustering. I was just wondering, are things like ports and rivers and natural resources important as well? That's maybe very traditional kind of thing, but only when you get that slide, it's all about knowledge, which of course is very important in certain types of industry. But I was just wondering about the more traditional, rocks, mountains, rivers, sea, natural resources, mines.
Absolutely. So let's say you might even say there are three types of explanations for where the industry will concentrate in space. It's those types you're mentioning right now. It's agglomeration externalities and it's spin-off dynamics, right? So I didn't talk about the first one, but you can easily include that in the model, right? Because you just say, okay, if you think that biotech will develop in those places where a technical university is, right? So let's say, you will include, so then all potential locations should at least have a technical university. But then still the question is, in which of those regions will the biotech concentrate, right? So a technical university might be a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition. And therefore you need either localization externalities or spin-off dynamics to explain why it happens in one of those potential locations and not in other potential locations. So you can include that in the model quite easily. Yeah.
So now let me start with that. Just another question. You talked a lot about longitudinal studies that you've done and the impressive data you seem to have, but you have not talked about any change over time in terms of importance of these factors. So do we see a change of the importance of space and locality?
Yes.
In a globalized, open, ICT, that web-based kind of innovation world, is there a change of the importance of co-location or not over time, because you are the one who's done it?
Yes, well, what you might even say is, referring to the study I did on the British car industry, what we could show is there, it really matters when a region is well endowed with those related industries, like I said, cycle making, or coach making industries, or mechanical engineering industries in general, but that's only true for the emergent phase. It's not true for the more mature phase of the industry. What we could also show is that when the industry already concentrated in the emergent phase through the spin-off process, it did not really affect the survival of those firms in that particular area where the industry concentrated space. But at the later stage, it became even a negative effect. So if you were located in the cluster, in this case in the Birmingham area, you were more likely to fail in the maturity phase, while this was not true in the emergence phase. So the more the industry concentrated, the harder it became for firms to survive.
That's because of competition effects.
Well, you don't know really, right? I mean, it could be competition effect, right? So if you enter that industry, and you enter that industry in a region where you already have a lot of competitors just around the corner, yes, then I can imagine it's really hard to survive. So that might be a competition effect. But it could also be a cost effect, right? So higher labor cost, higher land cost, congestion cost in general, as urban economists would call it.
Just thinking of organizational ecology literature, I would say, firms will concentrate through all these mechanisms, but then firm raising will be increasing. At some point, competition effects will lead to more greater exit, but still. So the ones that survive will outperform, but it will be tougher environment.
Yes, of course. The industry will also concentrate, right? So it will be transformed in overall holistic structure, right? So that happens at the same time. So the market structure becomes much more concentrated. So that's which, of course, in the beginning there's still a lot of experimentation going on in the emergent phase, and still a lot of room for many competitors. And so therefore also the entry rates are much more higher than, of course, in the later phase of the industry life cycle.
I'm just thinking that mature ecosystems actually find it very difficult to evolve as the environment around them changes.
Yes.
And you have peripheral isolation and everything.
Yeah.
When the Japanese arrived, either America or the UK, they didn't go to Detroit, they didn't go to Birmingham. They went to isolated sites like Sunderland,
Yes.
Derby, where they could pick up other engineering expertise, Swindon, Kentucky, California, Boston.
But still, they make life.
Evolution happens in peripheral isolation.
That's very interesting hypothesis. But still, of course, in those days already, it was already quite an international market, and of course also a national market. So it did not really matter so much where you located. The Japanese even outcompeted you when you were in, let's say, in Scotland producing. They still wiped out the producers in the Birmingham property area.
Yeah, but there is some literature that suggests they didn't want to locate in the Detroits
Yeah.
and the Birmingham Coventry literatures
Right.
because of the inherited institutionalized
Yes, absolutely.
working patterns, unions, engineering patterns,
Absolutely.
and everything else.
Yeah, the Japanese didn't really bother about that, right? So because in the end they said, well, okay, we have much better routines because of all kinds of organization and innovations we already have implemented, and the British were not able to take up.
I have spoken to some of the managers involved in the early days of some of that decision making, going back to Toyota in Kentucky,
Right.
and was told that they were actually deliberately avoiding the centres of so-called established expertise.
All right. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean,
It fits with what you said, because the routines don't fit that institutional context in that established
No.
region. So the practices around working, expectations.
yeah, but this is more, let's say, still more defined at the regional scale. While I would say, of course, the routines of the Japanese were so different from all UK firms. So it was also a national. There was also a national dimension to that.
Yeah.
But I think that reminds me, there's a kind of strong analogy with evolutionary biology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, what you're saying.
Yeah. And you could take the argument down a scale from firms to industry clusters and innovation in general.
It's a very good comment. I should think about more. Yeah. Thanks a lot. It's always nice about having those discussions, but you always pay a price for them. And that means, okay, I was talking about the networks. I already said, okay, doing cluster research and doing network analysis, what we tended to show is that it is not about location in cluster that matters, but it is to whom you connect. Then, of course, the question, also an interesting question, which I think people are now jumping on, is, okay, what drives knowledge network formation? Who connects with whom? And what kind of variables do we have to include to explain a knowledge network formation? Well, I already said you can look at the individual features of firms, because there is heterogeneity of firms in terms of the capabilities, how they can respond to external knowledge. But there are also forms of proximity. Then you go more to the dyadic level in network terms, and you look at the symmetry of attributes of agents, and you see to what extent they are similar. And this has been referred as various proximity dimension. Of course, from my field in economic geography, we're always very keen to know to what extent geographical proximity is, of course, a driving force in that. Is it true that the probability that you will connect and share knowledge with others, is that influenced by geographical distance? And of course, the hypothesis is that the more close you are, the better and the higher that probability. But what we now know is that that is not true per se. You have to control for other forms of proximity, like social proximity or institutional proximity, and there are cognitive proximity. And then you get a more fully developed framework, a more comprehensive framework, in which the probability to collaborate and exchange knowledge is depending on whether you share the same location, or whether you share the same norms and values, or whether you share the same knowledge base, etc. So, and then it, I think, becomes more comprehensive, and in fact, we have already done some models in which we try to test for that. But what you also tend to do, and now network methodology also makes that possible, is to look at the whole structure of the network and what is the position of firms in those whole networks. For example, preferential attachment is one of those forces that makes and that can influence who connects with whom. Preferential attachment meaning that the more connected you are in a network, the more likely you will also be connected to others in the future, depending, of course, on the costs that are involved in establishing new network linkages. So here you can also you can apply that and run estimations and see what variables are really driving this network formation. Then, of course, the question is, and that's also an interesting literature, okay, then we know about the position of each firm in a knowledge network, but does that really matter, right? Does that really affect performance of firms in those knowledge networks? Well, I think in general, if you oversee the literature, a knowledge linkage has a positive effect. But also, when you go to clusters and cluster firms, and then what we find is that the best performing cluster firms tend to show a high connectivity to firms outside the cluster. It's of course is quite natural in the sense, of course, the more successful you are, of course, the more you reach out to the outside world. So that's not very surprising, but I think it's quite systematic evidence for that. But then, of course, then the question is it really just a matter of being exposed to the outside world, being exposed to information that comes from outside the region or the cluster? Or it doesn't also matter with whom you connect in the outside? And this is a very intriguing question, and I think there's quite some substantial evidence that it is indeed a very important one. It's not a matter of being linked per se, but with whom a firm is connected. And then you can look, for example, at ego networks, and you can look at, okay, which are the partners a firm is connected to. And then, of course, for example, you can look at the proximity dimensions, and you might say, okay, I think the hypothesis is that the best performing firm is a firm that has partners has partners in the same region, but also with partners outside the region. But you might also say, well, you also need firms that are close to you in the cognitive dimension, but also that are far from you in the cognitive dimension. So when you're close in the cognitive dimension, it means that you can easily communicate and understand, and you can easily exchange knowledge. But you need also some partners that are at a more cognitive distance, because then you get some new and fresh ideas, and then you avoid being locked in at some point of time. And of course, this is an empirical literature that looks at, okay, what is the set of partners you have, what type of features do they have, what type of knowledge they might bring in, and can we see some general patterns there?
Yeah, I think you've already answered. I was wondering about Granovetter's 1973 paper on the strength of weak ties.
Yeah.
So indeed, to bring in new, I think you've already addressed
To me, that is social proximity.
Yeah.
I would define it as social proximity.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So here, it looks like you're looking at a more fine-grained explanation of spillovers effect being in a cluster, and you are digging a bit deeper, and so you're highlighting some other features. And you just mentioned the research on cognitive proximity, and I've seen that literature, and there is a dependent variable, which is innovative performance. So what would be the dependent variable here?
Well, I mean, it could be knowledge creation, right? So you could look at patent data. That's how you can look at the number of patents.
Yeah, I was talking about more generally speaking. So in terms of network research, understanding of network, what do we want to explain?
Yes.
In terms of
well, here we want
networks.
to explain the position of firms in a network, right? And how that evolves over time. Here we want to explain whether that really matters for performance of those firms. So that are the, let's say, the basic research questions you are interested in. And of course, then you can think about, okay, here's the position that is the dependent variable. The network position of a firm that is, so the probability, well, most of the time we are referring to what is the probability that you will connect to others. On what variables is that dependent? And then you have the three sets of variables that are outlined here. Here it's about, okay, what explains the innovative performance of firms? It is network position, one of the explanatory, is one of the independent variables in those type of models. Sure, we can think,
yeah, it was more a question that doesn't really need an answer in the sense it's really to try and think about the bigger picture of this evolutionary explanation of networks.
Right.
Just to give you something to think about.
Just while we're talking about variables, just very briefly for clarification, how would one typically operationalize cognitive proximity as a predictor in this sense?
Oh yeah, there are many ways to do that. Okay, I will come back to that in the last set of studies, because it's really about cognitive proximities and cognitive proximities between industries. So that's I will come back to that. Okay, and then I think the most exciting question about this type of research is how do spatial networks evolve over time. It's really about you explain the whole dynamics in a network. So not just looking at position of firms, but how the whole networks evolve over time. You look at nodes and they can enter and exit the network. You look at relationships, those can be created and dissolved. And you can embed that in a number of literatures that are out there in economic geography, like industry life cycle literature or the cluster life cycle approach. And you can really do some very interesting studies. For example, just to give you one example, is a study we did on the global video game industry, as I said, as I explained before. There we really run a network dynamic model in which a network is defined as ties between firms. And those ties exist when two firms co-develop a new video game, right? So that's a network tie. And then you want to explain who will co-develop with whom a video game. And then you might go back to the three set of variables I've included here. And for example, and then if you take a dynamic approach, what we could, for example, show the global video game industry is that geographical proximity becomes more important the more the industry evolves over time. And the reason why that is because the video games become more technologically complex. And so when you develop a new video game, it really means that you have to collaborate with many, and that is facilitated by the fact when you are co-located in the same geographical area. So geographical proximity was not really a driving force of network formation in the global video game industry in the emergent phase, but it became more important at later stages of the industry life cycle. Cognitive proximity, for example, became also more important. So two firms were more likely to collaborate and co-develop a new video game when they had more or less the same knowledge. And that became even more important over time. Also referring to the fact that co-developing a new video game is more technologically complex at the later stage of the life cycle of the industry. So you can play around and see whether the determinants of network formation, whether the importance of each determinant is changing over time. And this is what you do with this dynamic network models, and what you can and how you can apply it. Well, then there is a whole other bunch of literature, and I think you're quite familiar with that, is the spatial innovation system literature, of course, which was already developed in the 1980s and in the 1990s. Nelson, Freeman, Cook, we all know that were part of that. I won't say too much on that because I really, also because of the lack of time, I would, because you're quite familiar with this literature, I would like to skip this part and go to the last application. And this is really about regional growth. It's really about why some countries and why some regions outperform other countries and other regions. And there are two types of explanations in the field of evolutionary economic geography that have drawn a lot of attention. One is the notion of related variety, and the other one is how regions diversify over time. First, to start with the notion of related variety. One of the main questions in economic geography is about, okay, do you need specialized regions or diversified regions to enhance urban and regional growth, right? Also referring to Mark externalities and Jacob externalities as it is known in the literature. And there's a huge literature on that, a lot of empirical studies since 1992. that have tried to provide evidence for one of those hypotheses. And not that long ago, a number of meta-studies were done on all those empirical studies, and the meta-studies demonstrated that conclusions were not that straightforward, were not leading in one direction. Meaning that Jacob's externalities now and then were positive, had a positive effect on urban and regional growth, sometimes had a negative effect, sometimes had no effect. So in a way it was a kind of mess. And then we saw, well, maybe what maybe matters is not so much whether you have a wide set of industries present in a region, but maybe those industries should have something in common. For example, they should be technologically related. Because if that is the case, if you have a wide set of industries that are technologically related to each other, it will enhance knowledge spillovers, and therefore that will have a positive effect on urban and regional growth. So it is not a matter of having a diversified economy per se that matters for urban and regional growth, but it is a variety in related industries that matters and might have a positive effect on urban and regional growth. It's basically a very simple hypothesis that has been tested in many studies, and those studies tend to confirm that related variety in fact has a positive, significant effect on urban and regional growth. Of course, controlling for the usual suspects, what you normally do in the conventional growth model. So it really adds something to the explanation in those growth models. But then about how regions diversify at time, then I will come back to your questions about cognitive proximity. Because the last applications I would like to share with you is how regions diversify over time and how regions develop new growth paths. And there have been quite a number of studies in the late 2000s, 5-6 years ago, working papers by Hausmann, Hidalgo and Springer, that were saying, well, countries tend to expand and diversify into export sectors that are closely related to the existing export things. And countries with what we labeled have higher related variety have more opportunities to diversify and sustain higher economic growth rates. So it means that new export products that are developed, they do have a link with the export products that are already around in that particular country. The more related they are, the higher the probability that a new export product will be in fact developed in that particular country. So it might be the case that new export products, or if I may, new industries, are more likely to grow and develop in regions where they can depend and rely and draw on resources from related industries. And this has been labeled as branching process, and we have done a number of studies, and we confirm the outcome that in fact it happens at the national scale, but it's even more important at the regional scale. So capabilities that are present at the regional scales, so a set of related industries that are present at the regional scale, they increase the probability that a new industry will enter that particular region. Because there are more opportunities for new industries to emerge out of those existing related industries. Because they can recombine resources from those related industries and develop on the basis of that. Just let me clarify that a bit by referring to an empirical study we did on, which was published in Economic Geography, which was on the industry evolution of 70 Swedish regions during the period 1969-2002. So what we could do is we had wonderful data on Sweden for 70 Swedish regions, and we knew exactly when a new industry entered the region at some point of time in that period of almost 35 years. So we had 2,766 events of an industry entering the region, and we wanted to know to what extent the probability that a new industry will enter a region is depending on the degree of technological relatedness with other industries at the region scale. And now I come to your question. First, of course, we had to build a measure of cognitive proximity between industries. because we first have to know to what extent industries are technologically related to each other. Well, in this study we used product data at the plant level. So we had for each Swedish plant, we knew exactly what type of products they produced in what year. So for example, whether they produced apples or oranges or steel or cars or whatever, and we could distinguish between more than 1,000 different products. So what we did, basically what we did here, we measured product relatedness, which was based on co-occurrence analysis. So what you do is you look at the frequency of combinations of products reoccurring at the plant level. So if two products, the two same products, in combination reappear at the plant level again and again, we assume those are being related, because there's a kind of economies of scope argument behind that, because you produce those two products with the same machinery, with the same set of people, with the same set of skills, etc. So we can then have a matrix for each pair of products, and we can exactly define the degree of relatedness based on this co-occurrence analysis. Well, if you aggregate those data to industries, you can build a network like this. So you get the whole, first of all, you get the whole new taxonomy of the Swedish economy. Each node stands for an industry, and if there is a link between two industries, it means they are technologically related above a certain threshold. If there is no link between two industries, it means that they are not technologically related, that at least their score is below that threshold. So for example, well here for example you have glass and glass products. Well, of course they are related, right? That's not come as a surprise, because what they have in common is that they have competences in glass, but they are still different industries, right? So you can build an indicator of relatedness between these. So this is, in this case, how we measure cognitive proximity between industries in this case. And then we want to see how regions diversify over time. So what is the probability that a new industry will enter the region, and is that positively related to the degree of relatedness with existing industries at the regional scale? Because that is what you expect. And in fact, having a high number of events of a new industries entering the region, we could indeed find systematic evidence that a new industry is more likely to emerge in a region where there are industries to which it is technologically related. The same we did for disappearance from the region. So is an industry more likely to disappear from a region when it is not technologically related to any other industry in that region? And we found very strong and robust evidence for that. We have done this type of studies already in the US, in Spain, in Germany, and we all come to the same conclusion. So it's a very strong and robust result. We also look at the growth and decline of industries, and whether that is depending on the degree of technological relatedness with other industries at the regional scale, and it is.
When you say exit, do you include extinction? Firms that simply cease to exist, stop trading?
Yeah, I mean, you don't know what's going on, of course. They just disappear from your data set, right?
Yeah.
So that's an exit.
Yeah.
So, and you can measure that in many ways, right? So we did a lot of sensitivity checks. For example, if there are 5 plants at the regional scale, you say, okay, the industry is present. If it's below that, then the industry will disappear from the region. You can look at 10 plants, you can look at 2 plants. Okay, you can do this sensitivity analysis. It did not change the results.
Okay, thank you.
So what we found here, I think is very interesting, is when you look at structural change and you look at the rise and fall of industries, it seems to be subject to a path-dependent process. Because history matters in this respect. It is not a coincidence that some new industries emerge in some particular regions and that some industries will disappear from regions. It has much to do with the industrial structure that is present at the region, and therefore we think we have some evidence here that even for the rise and fall of industries, we find some evidence of a path-dependent process. Of course, what you normally do when you look at path-dependent process you explain why a country or a region is very good in one particular specialization, and then of course you're going to explain that this industry, that this region or country will also accelerate industries 2 or 5 or 10 years later. And then we say, okay, this is a path-dependent process. Here we look at structural change. Here we look at industrial dynamics, and those seem to be also subject to a process of path dependence. Well, of course, this type of analysis you could, there's still a lot of work to be done. You can think about many questions. For example, about this industry space and how we define that. Okay, this is an industry space for Sweden, and we define the degree of technological relatedness between industries in Sweden. But it might be very specific to the Swedish economy. Is it true that when you do an exercise like that in Germany, that the industry space of Germany looks similar as the industry space in Sweden? I think from a geographical point of view, that's extremely interesting. Right? To what extent is there overlap between industry spaces in different countries?
Ron, I'm just curious, when you put that on top of geography of Sweden, how does it look? Does it?
I was thinking the same, because that is an industrial network, right? There is a geography there.
This is a spatial, right? This, so I don't know how it looked like. I mean, so
in a sense
we have
that,
not done that.
Yeah, in a sense that whether, after all, the cognitive mapping of industry structure, as you said, and the change in industry structure, does geography still matter in that all the betweenness cluster?
Okay. We have, in this paper I was talking about, we have done this study, so this is for the, so we, let's say we labeled, we pulled all the data in our model for all 70 Swedish regions. But of course you can do repeat this analysis for every region. So again, I can look at this industry space in Stockholm region, and I can see which sectors were always present in that region, which sectors entered and which sectors exited. And to what extent that depended on the degree of relatedness with industries that were already present in the Stockholm region. And indeed we found the same similar results. It's relatedness that really matters and drives this process of diversification.
And so, also because some regions must be, let's say the Stockholm region is more dense, so there will be more a higher variety of industries, where maybe other regions that are more remote, more specialized in some industries.
Yes. So let's say the probability that regions will diversify depends on the density, or I would say depends on the related variety, right? Because the more industries are related to each other, if industries emerge because of recombination, it means that the more related industries are present, the more related variety is present in the region, the more opportunities there are for industries to recombine and to develop into new industries. And this is in fact what we have tested in those studies. Of course, you could still say, okay, you have peripheral regions, and there might be only a very few industries. But still, those have opportunities to diversify into new industries while building on what they already have. But of course, the opportunities to do so is much less in those regions. Yeah. Sorry.
You've talked about the supply side, and I think only one bullet point about demand side. And your discussion of, or your study of video games made me think that social networking on the demand side would be quite an important factor.
Yeah. Well, we included the demand side in that particular video game industry exercise because what we found, okay, so we wanted to see to what extent national cultures had an impact on knowledge network formation in the video game industry. You might expect that, of course, Korean firms are more likely to collaborate with each other and Japanese firms as well, because of a different national culture. Right? Video games might also have a specific language, anyhow. So the national dimension might be quite important for that, and we also tested for that. But I think that also why, for example, cognitive proximity became much more important over time for knowledge network formation in that particular industry is also because consumers also would like are buying games from, let's say, producers that have a high reputation. Because nowadays, well, as far as I've understood, because I never play video games, but as far as I've understood, is that, I mean, you need a lot of information before you decide when you buy a video game, because the video games have become so complex, and there are so much things in each video game, and before you understand as a potential consumer, you really have to read a lot. And so then it might be the case that reputation of a producer is very important, and indeed we interpreted our finding that has become much more important over time because the video games have become much more technologically complex. Also, consumers really need much more information before they decide which video game to buy, and therefore they rely on reputation of producers, and that's why it also we find that the most dominant firms also are more likely to be connected to other dominant firms over the industry lifecycle. But you're right. I mean, the demand side is not that much part of what we have done so far, especially for this type of studies.
Yeah, but there will be some relationships between industries that are due to a supply chain. So Fred is talking about the final demand. Clearly there will be a relatedness.
Yeah, but then I would
vertical rather than horizontal.
But then I would favor another relatedness indicator, because then I would look at input-output relationships between industries.
Yeah.
Right? This is, let's say, the oldest indicator of relatedness we have. Is okay when industries share the same industries from which they draw inputs, then those are defined as technologically related, and then you have a new relatedness indicator. You get a new taxonomies of industries, and then you're going to see whether you can still explain this process of regional diversification. So that would be interesting. But what we also do is, and also coming back on a question before, is the most preferred indicator of relatedness we have developed so far is the degree of skill relatedness between industries, which is more focused on degree of intensity of labor flows between industries. And especially a PhD student of my former PhD student of mine, Frank Nefke, has really developed that indicator. So what the idea is that if two industries show a lot of labor mobility, it probably means that employees that have acquired skills in that industry are also very relevant for that industry. Of course, you control for all kinds of factors that might determine this flow of people changing job, like wage differentials between industries, so you control for that. And then I think you get quite a clean indicator of what is called skill relatedness between industries. And I think that is also, again, another measure of relatedness. And as we know, a lot of knowledge is circulated through an economy, through labor mobility. I don't think research collaboration is that important. I think labor mobility is a much more important driver of that. And if you have an indicator like that, in fact, we have just completed a study on Sweden, and we looked at labor market externalities and whether that affects urban and regional growth in Sweden. And we looked at the variety of industries that are skill-related in particular regions, and the more skill-related industries are, the higher economic growth in regions. So we find a very strong effect for it. And this gives more, let's say, body to also this labor market externalities concept. Because still so far, we just assume that supply and demand of labor fits more nicely in, let's say, dense urban areas. But we never measure it. Here you have an exact measure. You actually measure labor flows, and you look at the intensity of labor flows. And what you expect is that labor flows between skill-related industries matter more and will enhance more knowledge transfers between firms and industries, and that might have an additional effect on urban and regional growth. And we found support for that in our empirical studies. Yes.
Do we maybe is there another question or?
Can I have a slightly more technical question? In your evolution model, did you use the exponential random graph models, or you use the diet longitudinal model?
The longitudinal model. That I think was more convenient in this type of exercises. But we can talk about that.
I have a question. The structure of related induction relations. The relations, how can, what's the effect to calculate the relations?
Sorry again.
The relations of different industry.
Yes.
What is your indicator to calculate the relations?
Well, in this measure we looked at product relatedness, right? So we looked, okay, which industry produce which products, and we do that also for another industry. And so, and if the same two products reappear at the plant level, we define those as product relatedness. And this is what is shown here in this